Gunfire echoes are nothing compared to the deafening silence of a completely dark world. Andrew hadn't seen his own face in 7 years, living in a self-imposed exile, wrapped in bitterness and the phantom pain of shrapnel. The Department of Veterans Affairs told him he needed a companion. They brought him a monster. Titan wasn't just a dog. He was a heavily scarred, Navy SEAL-trained German Shepherd scheduled for lethal injection after nearly tearing an officer's arm off. It was supposed to be a colossal mistake, a tragic accident waiting to happen. Instead, it became the most terrifyingly beautiful bond forged in blood, and what Titan did on a freezing November night would rewrite everything the military thought they knew about loyalty. Shadows did not exist for Andrew Pendleton. There was no gradient of light, no dimming of the sun, no silhouette of trees against a twilight sky. There was only the absolute, suffocating weight of permanent midnight. 7 years ago, in the dusty, unforgiving expanses of the Helmand province, an improvised explosive device had detonated beneath the chassis of his Humvee. The blast had taken the lives of 3 men in his squad and permanently severed Andrew's optic nerves. He returned to American soil with a chest full of medals, a heart full of guilt, and a world stripped of visual color. Now, Andrew lived in a secluded, heavily wooded property on the outskirts of Bend, Oregon. The isolation was intentional. Society pitied him, and Andrew despised pity more than he despised the darkness. His cabin was a meticulously organized map of tactile landmarks. He knew precisely how many paces it took to get from the edge of his bed to the cast-iron wood stove. 14. From the kitchen sink to the heavy oak front door. 22. And from the back porch to the chopping block, where he split firewood purely by sound and muscle memory. 35. The Veterans Affairs Office had been relentlessly pushing him to integrate back into society, or at the very least, accept a service animal. Elena Higgins, a persistent but well-meaning VA liaison, had brought 3 different dogs to Andrew's cabin over the past 2 years. The first was a sweet-tempered golden retriever named Bailey, who cowered under the sofa every time Andrew threw one of his terrifying, PTSD-fueled night terrors. The second was a highly trained Labrador, who possessed all the mechanical skills of a seeing eye dog but lacked the steel Andrew required in a companion. Andrew didn't want a nursemaid. He didn't want a pet to stroke while watching television he couldn't see. "I need a soldier, Elena," Andrew had said, his voice raspy like dry leaves scraping across asphalt, dismissing the third dog, a gentle standard poodle. "I don't need something to fetch my slippers. I live in the woods. I live in my own head. If you're going to bring an animal into this house, bring me one that understands what it means to survive. Bring me a dog that isn't afraid of the dark." Elena had sighed, the rustle of her clipboard sounding loud in the quiet cabin. "Andrew, service dogs are trained to be calm, to de-escalate, to guide. You're asking for a guard dog. And the VA doesn't issue aggressive animals. It's an extreme liability." "Then stop bringing me dogs," Andrew had replied, turning his sightless eyes toward the window, listening to the wind howl through the Douglas firs. "I'm fine, alone." But Andrew wasn't fine. The night terrors were worsening. The phantom smell of cordite and burning rubber haunted his sleep. He kept a loaded Colt M1911 in a biometric safe beside his bed, and lately, he had found himself resting his hand on the cold steel just to feel grounded. The isolation was metastasizing into a dangerous paranoia. He heard footsteps in the rustling leaves that weren't there. He sensed eyes watching his cabin from the tree line. Little did Andrew know, Elena had reached the end of her rope with traditional service animal organizations. Driven by a desperate need to save the stubbornly reclusive veteran from completely losing his mind, she had made a phone call to a contact at a military working dog rehabilitation center located hundreds of miles away. It was a facility that handled dogs the civilian world was never meant to see. 300 miles north, at a high-security holding facility within Joint Base Lewis McChord. Doctor. Olivia Jenkins stood outside kennel number 4, her hands jammed deep into the pockets of her white coat. The air in the concrete corridor smelled sharply of bleach, fear, and damp fur. Inside, the chain-link enclosure paced a nightmare. His name was Titan. He was a 90-pound purebred German shepherd, but his lineage was the only standard thing about him. Titan had been bred, raised, and trained by the United States Naval Special Warfare Development Group. He wasn't a police dog trained to sniff out contraband or chase fleeing suspects down suburban streets. Titan was a Tier 1 operational asset. He had been deployed on Black Ops missions that didn't officially exist, dropped from helicopters in the dead of night, and trained to silently neutralize armed combatants in close-quarters combat. Titan's physical appearance was a testament to a life of violence. A jagged, hairless scar ran from the base of his left ear down to his jawline, a souvenir from a grazing AK-47 round. A chunk of his right ear was missing. His coat was thick, dark, and coarse, blending seamlessly into the shadows he was trained to operate within. But it was his eyes that unsettled the base personnel. They were a piercing, unblinking amber, radiating a cold, calculated intelligence that felt uncomfortably human. Titan was scheduled for euthanasia at 0800 hours the following morning. 6 months prior, during a botched raid on a cartel-funded weapons cache in Central America, Titan's handler, Chief Petty Officer David Miller, had been fatally wounded. According to the after-action report, Titan had stood over Miller's bleeding body for an agonizing 48 hours in the sweltering jungle. When the extraction team finally breached the perimeter, Titan, driven mad by grief, dehydration, and protective instinct, had failed to recognize friend from foe. He had attacked the medics, trying to reach Miller, nearly severing a corpsman's brachial artery. Since returning to the States, Titan had been completely unmanageable. He rejected every new handler, responding to commands with lethal aggression. He had become a loaded weapon with a broken safety, pacing his kennel relentlessly, waiting for a commander who was never coming back. "He's a lost cause, Olivia," Base Commander General Thomas Reed said, stepping up beside the veterinarian. "I know you hate it. I hate it too. He's a hero, but he's severely traumatized, highly lethal, and utterly unpredictable. We can't rehabilitate him, and we sure as hell can't adopt him out to some suburban family." Olivia watched Titan pivot smoothly at the end of his enclosure, his claws clicking rhythmically against the concrete. "He doesn't need a suburban family, General," she said quietly. "He needs a mission. He's dying of uselessness in here. His war is over." Reed replied firmly. "Sign the authorization, Doc." Olivia had the pen in her hand when her cell phone buzzed. It was Elena Higgins. Olivia had met Elena years ago during a seminar on canine PTSD. As Elena quickly outlined the impossibly stubborn, deeply damaged blind veteran in Oregon who demanded a dog that understood war, Olivia looked back at Titan. The dog had stopped pacing. He was staring directly at her, those amber eyes boring into her soul, his chest heaving with silent intensity. "Elena," Olivia interrupted, her voice trembling slightly. "I have a dog, but he's not a service animal. He's a weapon, and if this goes wrong, your veteran could be seriously injured. Or worse." "Andrew is already dying, Olivia." Elena's voice came through the receiver, laced with desperation. The bureaucratic gymnastics required to release a condemned, highly dangerous military asset to a blind civilian were staggering, but Olivia pushed it through under the guise of an experimental, last-resort psychiatric hold. 2 days later, a heavily reinforced transport van pulled onto the gravel driveway of Andrew Pendleton's secluded cabin. Andrew stood on his porch, the cold November wind biting through his flannel shirt. He heard the heavy crunch of tires, the slam of a heavy metal door, and then a sound that made the hair on his arms stand up. It was a low, vibrating growl that seemed to emanate not from a throat, but from the earth itself. It was a sound devoid of fear. It was a promise of violence. "Andrew," Olivia called out, walking backward toward the porch, holding a thick leather lead with both hands. "This is Titan. I need to warn you, he is muzzled. and he is extremely dangerous. Do not make sudden movements." Andrew didn't flinch. He listened to the heavy, deliberate footfalls of the animal. This wasn't the frantic skittering of a golden retriever. These were the measured, tactical steps of a predator. "Bring him up," Andrew commanded. "Andrew, please," Elena gasped, standing near the van. "Maybe this was a mistake." "Bring him up," Andrew repeated, stepping off the porch and onto the gravel. Olivia, sweating despite the freezing temperature, allowed Titan to close the distance. Titan was practically dragging her, his muscles bunching, a vicious snarl vibrating through his heavy wire basket muzzle. He locked onto Andrew, a stranger, a potential threat. Andrew stopped walking. He stood perfectly still, his blind eyes staring straight ahead. He didn't offer a hand to sniff. He didn't speak in a high-pitched, soothing tone. He simply stood his ground, radiating a calm, unyielding authority. Titan lunged, hitting the end of the heavy leather leash with a bone-jarring snap that nearly pulled Olivia off her feet. He barked a concussive, explosive sound that echoed off the pine trees. Andrew didn't move a muscle. He didn't blink. He breathed in deeply, smelling the distinct odors of military-grade canvas, wet fur, ozone, and the sharp tang of adrenaline. "He's angry," Andrew stated calmly over the noise. "He thinks he failed." Olivia strained to hold the dog back. "How do you know that?" "Because I smell it on him." "It's the same thing I smell when I wake up," Andrew said. Slowly, deliberately, Andrew lowered himself to one knee, putting his face directly at the level of the violently struggling shepherd. "Andrew, back away!" Olivia screamed. "Release the tension on the leash," Andrew ordered. "He will bite you!" "Drop the leash, Doc." "That's an order." The command barked out of Andrew with the sharp, unquestionable authority of a battlefield commander. Trembling, Olivia let the leather strap slip from her fingers. The heavy brass clip of the leash hit the gravel with a dull clink. For a fraction of a second, the world held its breath. Elena covered her mouth, fully expecting to witness the veteran being mauled. Titan froze. The resistance he had been fighting against was suddenly gone. He stood 2 feet from Andrew's face. The low growl rumbled in his chest, a continuous, menacing idle of an engine ready to rev. Andrew remained on one knee, his hands resting casually on his thighs. "I can't see you," Andrew spoke softly, his voice dropping the commanding edge, replacing it with a quiet, gravelly truth. "But I know exactly what you are. They took your eyes too, didn't they? They took your purpose." Titan stepped forward. The heavy wire of his muzzle bumped harshly against Andrew's chest. Andrew didn't pull back. Slowly, Andrew raised his right hand. He didn't reach for the top of the dog's head, a dominant move that would trigger an attack. Instead, he presented the back of his hand, low and steady, near Titan's chest. Titan inhaled deeply, his wet nose taking in the scent of the man before him. He smelled the cordite residue deeply embedded in Andrew's boots, a smell Titan knew intimately. He smelled the faint, lingering odor of old blood and scar tissue. But most importantly, he smelled the absolute absence of fear. Dogs, especially those trained for combat, are masters of reading human biochemistry. They can smell the cortisol spike of terror. Andrew had none. He possessed the grounded, stoic energy of a man who had already died once and had nothing left to fear from death. Slowly, the growl in Titan's chest died down. He pressed his massive, blocky head against Andrew's outstretched hand, pushing with enough force to rock the veteran backwards slightly. "Take the muzzle off," Andrew said. "Andrew, I cannot do that," Olivia objected, her heart hammering against her ribs. "He's only known you for 2 minutes. If he wanted to kill me, he would have done it by ramming my throat with the cage," Andrew replied, his fingers tracing the thick leather straps buckled behind Titan's ears. "He's trapped. We both are. Take it off." Reluctantly, Olivia stepped forward. Her hands shook as she undid the heavy brass buckle. The wire basket fell to the gravel. Titan shook his head, his ears snapping to attention. He opened his jaws, revealing rows of pristine, terrifyingly sharp teeth, and let out a long, heavy sigh. He sat down heavily in the gravel, leaning his scarred shoulder against Andrew's thigh. The transaction was complete. Elena and Olivia left an hour later, leaving behind a massive crate of specialized food, a stack of medical files, and a dog the military had deemed a lethal liability. The first 3 days in the cabin were a grueling test of wills. Titan was destructive. He paced the small living room like a caged tiger, his claws gouging deep scratches into the hardwood floor. He refused to eat the kibble Olivia had left, knocking the stainless steel bowl across the kitchen in a fit of frustration. At night, he would sit by the heavy oak front door, staring at the handle, whining softly, waiting for a handler who was buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Andrew gave him space. He didn't try to force affection. He navigated his dark world with his usual precision, ignoring the massive predator pacing his halls. He cooked a plain, rare steak on the third evening, chopped it into large pieces, and set it on a plate on the floor. He didn't call the dog. He simply sat in his armchair, poured himself a glass of bourbon, and waited. In the darkness, Andrew heard the soft padding of paws. He heard the wet sound of jaws snapping up the meat, and then the heavy thud of a 90-pound animal lying down on the rug beside his chair. A warm, heavy head rested against Andrew's booted foot. "We're going to be all right, soldier," Andrew whispered into the blackness. The real shift, the forging of the blood oath between man and dog, happened during the first winter storm 2 weeks later. The barometric pressure dropped rapidly, bringing a violent thunderstorm that battered the Oregon pines. A massive clap of thunder shook the cabin, sounding identical to a 155 millimeters artillery shell. Andrew, who was standing by the sink, dropped a glass. It shattered loudly on the floor. Instantly, Andrew was transported back to Kandahar. He dropped to his knees, his hands covering his ears, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps as the phantom smell of burning metal filled his nostrils. He couldn't see the kitchen. He only saw the blinding flash of the IED. Titan reacted instantly, but not with panic. His combat training overrode his trauma. Seeing his new commander compromised, Titan didn't cower. He moved through the broken glass without hesitation. He approached Andrew and forcefully shoved his heavy body into Andrew's chest, knocking the veteran backward against the cabinets. Andrew gasped, fighting the heavy weight pressing against him. But Titan didn't bite. Instead, the dog threw his front paws over Andrew's shoulders and laid his massive chest directly against Andrew's hammering heart, applying deep pressure therapy, a skill he had never been explicitly taught for civilian PTSD, but an instinctual pack behavior to ground a panicking alpha. Titan began to lick the cold sweat off Andrew's face, whining low and steady, anchoring the blind man to the present. Andrew buried his face in the dog's thick neck fur, his hands wrapping around the solid, muscular torso. The storm raged outside, but inside, the war slowly faded. From that night on, Titan was Andrew's shadow. The pacing stopped. The aggression was channeled into an intense, hyper-vigilant focus on Andrew's safety. Titan learned Andrew's blindness not through training, but through observation. He naturally began to guide Andrew around unseen obstacles in the yard, pressing his shoulder against Andrew's knee to signal a change in terrain. But Titan's protective instincts were a double-edged sword. He had accepted Andrew as his new commanding officer, which meant the cabin and the surrounding property were now their operational base, and Titan was prepared to defend it with lethal force. 4 weeks into their partnership, the deep, biting cold of late November settled over the woods. Andrew was asleep, Titan curled at the foot of the bed, a solid mass of muscle and warmth. At 2 a.m., Titan's head snapped up. His ears swiveled toward the window. Andrew, a light sleeper trained to wake at the slightest shift in his environment, felt the sudden absence of the dog's weight on the mattress. "Titan," Andrew whispered into the dark. There was no sound from the dog. No growl, no bark, just the faint click of claws on the floorboards as Titan moved with terrifying stealth out of the bedroom and toward the front hall. Andrew sat up, the hair on the back of his neck prickling. He reached into his biometric safe, his fingers wrapping around the cold grip of his M1911 pistol. He didn't know what was outside. He didn't know that a black SUV with cut headlights had just rolled to a silent stop at the end of his driveway, carrying 3 men whose intent was far deadlier than a simple robbery. Andrew only knew one thing. Titan had gone silent, and a silent Navy SEAL dog was a dog preparing to go to war. The silence in the cabin was heavier than the winter air outside. Andrew stood beside his bed, the M1911 gripped loosely but securely in his right hand. To a sighted man, the pitch-black room would be a profound disadvantage. To Andrew, it was his tactical domain. He didn't need light. He needed acoustics. Outside, the temperature had plummeted to 14 degrees, freezing the light layer of snow into a brittle crust. 3 men moved up the driveway. Their names were Silas, Cole, and Briggs. They were part of a localized methamphetamine ring that operated out of the Deschutes National Forest. They weren't masterminds, but they were ruthless, driven by addiction and the desperate need for quick cash. Word had circulated through the darker corners of Bend that a blind, reclusive veteran lived alone in the woods, supposedly sitting on a safe full of VA back pay and high-end firearms. To them, Andrew was a ghost. An easy mark. Inside the hallway, Titan stood entirely motionless, his body pressed flat against the wall beside the front door. This was a tactic drilled into him during countless hostage rescue simulations at the Naval Special Warfare Center. He didn't stand in the fatal funnel of the doorway. He waited in the blind spot. His amber eyes were fixed on the brass doorknob, his muscles coiled like industrial steel springs. He didn't whine. He didn't growl. A barking dog is a deterrent. A silent dog is an ambush. Andrew moved with deliberate, practiced steps. 7 paces down the hall. He stopped 10 feet behind Titan, using the solid oak frame of the bathroom door as cover. Crunch, crunch. The sound of heavy boots breaking the frozen crust of snow outside was magnified in Andrew's ears. 3 distinct sets of footsteps. 1 heavy, dragging slightly, likely a large man. 2 lighter, quicker. They stopped at the base of the wooden porch stairs. No lights, a muffled voice whispered through the exterior wall. It was Silas. He's blind anyway. Briggs, pop the lock. Cole, you're first in. If the old man is awake, put him to sleep. Fast. Andrew's thumb rested on the safety of the 1911. His heart rate, incredibly, began to drop. The anxiety that plagued his civilian life vanished, replaced by the icy, hyper-focused clarity of a soldier stepping back onto the battlefield. He clicked his tongue against the roof of his mouth, a sharp, single snick. It was a sound Elena had never heard, but Titan knew it instantly. It was the preliminary release command. It meant, target acquired, stand by for engagement. Titan's ears flattened against his skull. The fur along his spine stood rigidly on end. On the porch, Briggs slid a pair of tension wrenches into the deadbolt. The scraping of metal on metal vibrated through the wood. Andrew visualized the mechanism turning. He tracked the seconds in his head. Click. The heavy deadbolt disengaged. The brass handle slowly rotated downward. The rusted hinges of the heavy oak door let out a low, agonizing squeal as it was pushed inward. The freezing wind immediately rushed into the cabin, bringing with it the harsh smells of cheap tobacco, unwashed bodies, and gun oil. A beam from a high-lumen tactical flashlight sliced through the darkness, sweeping across the empty living room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the cold air. Clear, Cole muttered, his massive frame stepping over the threshold, a sawed-off shotgun held at his hip. Briggs stepped in right behind him, followed by Silas, who quietly pulled the door shut to trap the heat and the noise. They stood in the entryway, waiting for their eyes to adjust, assuming the silence meant the blind man was fast asleep. They had no idea they had just walked into a kill zone. Andrew didn't raise his weapon. He simply opened his mouth and issued a single, guttural word in Pashto, a language Titan's former handler had used to ensure commands couldn't be easily replicated by enemy combatants. Brej. Strike. The ensuing violence did not sound like a dog attack. It sounded like a car crash. Titan launched himself from the shadows with terrifying kinetic energy. He didn't target Cole's legs or torso. Standard police K9s are trained to bite and hold. Titan was a tier. One military asset trained to immediately neutralize an armed combatant's ability to fight. He went for the weapon arm. 90 pounds of muscle and teeth hit Cole's right forearm just as the man raised the shotgun. The sheer force of the impact lifted the 250-pound intruder completely off his feet. Cole didn't even have time to scream before his shoulder slammed into the hardwood floor with a sickening crunch. The shotgun clattered harmlessly away, sliding under the sofa. Titan's jaws locked around Cole's radius and ulna with bone-crushing pressure. The dog didn't thrash wildly. He pinned the man to the floor, dropping his own center of gravity, issuing a low, vibrating snarl that sounded like a chainsaw idling against bone. "What the hell?" Briggs shrieked, dropping his flashlight. The beam spun wildly across the floor, creating dizzying, chaotic shadows against the walls. "Shoot it! Shoot the damn dog!" Silas roared, pulling a 9mm pistol from his waistband, desperately trying to track the dark, writhing mass on the floor. Before Silas could align his sights, a sound cut through the chaos, freezing the blood in his veins. Clack, clack. The unmistakable, heavy metallic sound of a .45 caliber slide being racked echoed from the pitch-black hallway. "The next man who moves a muscle dies," Andrew's voice boomed. It wasn't the trembling voice of an elderly victim. It was the voice of a man who had called in airstrikes. It was cold, deep, and absolutely devoid of hesitation. "Drop the weapon." Silas froze, his pistol half raised. He couldn't see Andrew in the darkness of the hall, but he knew the barrel of a heavy-caliber weapon was pointed squarely at his chest. On the floor, Cole was whimpering, paralyzed by the agonizing pressure of Titan's jaws, terrified that any movement would result in his arm being torn off. Briggs, panicked and entirely out of his depth, made a fatal miscalculation. He lunged toward the front door, desperate to escape. "Fast!" Andrew commanded sharply. Titan instantly released Cole's mangled arm. With supernatural agility, the shepherd pivoted and launched himself at the fleeing Briggs. He struck Briggs square in the center of the back, driving the smaller man face first into the solid oak door. Briggs collapsed into a heap, gasping for air as Titan stood over him, one heavy paw planted firmly on the back of the intruder's neck, teeth bared inches from his ear. Silas stood trembling in the center of the room. His flashlight, still rolling on the floor, briefly illuminated the scene. He saw the massive, heavily scarred K9 pinning his accomplice, and then the beam swept over the hallway. Standing there was Andrew, barefoot in the freezing draft, his unseeing eyes staring straight through Silas, the M1000, 911 leveled perfectly at center mass. "I can hear your heart beating from here," Andrew said evenly, "and I can hear your finger shaking against the trigger guard. Put it on the floor." Now, Silas slowly opened his hand, letting the 9mm drop. It hit the floorboards with a dull thud. "Kick it away." Silas complied, sliding the weapon across the room. "Titan," Andrew said, his voice dropping to a softer but still commanding tone. The K9 immediately stepped back from Briggs, though his eyes never left the intruders. He moved backward, seamlessly inserting himself between the three men and Andrew, a living shield of muscle and loyalty. "There's a landline on the kitchen counter. To your left." Andrew instructed Silas. Dial 911. Tell the dispatcher you broke into the home of Andrew Pendleton and you require immediate medical assistance. Tell them to send the sheriff. For the next 20 minutes, no one moved. The only sounds in the cabin were Cole's ragged breathing, the howling wind outside, and the steady, rhythmic panting of the dog. When the flashing red and blue lights finally cut through the darkness of the woods, accompanied by the wail of sirens, Andrew safely decocked his weapon and set it on the hall table. Sheriff Davies and 3 deputies burst through the door, weapons drawn, expecting a bloodbath. Instead, they found 3 hardened criminals, utterly immobilized by terror. Cole was clutching a severely lacerated arm. Briggs was weeping quietly by the door, and Silas was sitting rigidly on a dining chair, his hands laced behind his head. Sitting perfectly still in the center of the room, calmly watching the deputies enter, was Titan. Davies, who had known Andrew for years, holstered his weapon and looked at the carnage, then at the massive K9, and finally at the blind veteran standing quietly in the hall. Andrew. Davies breathed in disbelief, looking at the precision of the takedowns. What exactly did they send you? Andrew reached down, his fingers finding the thick fur of Titan's neck. The dog leaned into the touch, the lethal predator instantly melting back into a devoted guardian. They sent me a soldier, Andrew replied softly. But as the paramedics loaded Cole onto a stretcher, one of the deputies shone his heavy maglite over Titan's flank, revealing a faded, complex serial number tattooed on the dog's inner ear, a mark strictly reserved for the highest echelon of the Department of Defense. The deputy's radio crackled, and what he whispered to his superior would set off a chain reaction that Andrew could never have anticipated. The military wasn't finished with Titan yet. Morning broke over the Oregon pines, painting the blood-stained snow in harsh, unforgiving light. Sheriff Davies had spent the entire night processing the chaotic scene inside the cabin. Cole's shattered arm had required an immediate, high-speed ambulance transport for emergency reconstructive surgery. Briggs and Silas were currently locked in the Deschutes County holding cells, shivering in their orange jumpsuits, still haunted by the glowing amber eyes of the beast that had dismantled them in seconds. Deputy Carlson, a young rookie with a penchant for overstepping his bounds, had stayed behind to file the preliminary paperwork. Unable to shake the chilling precision of the dog's attacks, Carlson had copied the faded serial number tattooed inside Titan's left ear. Back at the precinct, driven by sheer curiosity, he ran the sequence through the National Crime Information Center database. It bounced. Frowning, Carlson routed the inquiry through a federal back channel accessible to local law enforcement for identifying stolen military property. That single, innocuous keystroke triggered a silent, Priority 1 alarm 2000. 500 miles away at the Pentagon. Deep within the subterranean levels of the Department of Defense, Colonel Harrison Sterling was staring at a glowing monitor. Sterling was a logistics and asset recovery specialist for naval special warfare. He did not deal in emotions, trauma, or rehabilitation. He dealt in government property, and according to his screen, a tier, 1 biological weapon, a dog classified as highly lethal, irredeemable, and officially marked deceased via euthanasia 3 weeks prior, was currently sitting in the living room of a blind, medically retired civilian in the Pacific Northwest. "Get me Base Commander Reed at Lewis McCord," Sterling barked at his aide, his voice devoid of warmth, "and find out exactly who signed the fraudulent destruction order for Asset 77, Bravo." Within 3 hours, the bureaucratic hammer fell on Dr. Olivia Jenkins. Military police escorted her from her veterinary clinic to a sterile interrogation room. Sterling, appearing via secure video link, didn't mince words. He threatened her with federal charges of grand larceny, falsifying official military documents, and reckless endangerment of a civilian. Olivia, trembling but resolute, held her ground. "You were going to kill him, Colonel. He's a decorated veteran. Not a broken rifle. I transferred him under a localized psychiatric hold for a disabled combat veteran. The paperwork is legally gray, but it is not fraudulent. You transferred a loaded grenade with the pin pulled, Doctor, Sterling replied coldly. Asset 77. Bravo is responsible for nearly severing a corpsman's arm. He is defective. He belongs to the United States Navy, and we are neutralizing the liability. A recovery team is already wheels up. Back in Bend, the landline in Andrew's kitchen rang with an aggressive shrillness. Andrew was sitting in his leather armchair, nursing a black coffee. Titan was resting heavily across Andrew's feet, completely exhausted from the adrenaline dump of the previous night's combat. The dog's ears twitched at the phone's ring, but he didn't move. Andrew navigated the 22 paces to the kitchen counter and picked up the receiver. Pendleton. Andrew, it's Elena. The VA liaison's voice was frantic, breathless with panic. You have to take the dog and leave the cabin. Right now. I just got a call from Olivia's lawyer. The military knows Titan is there. They know about the break-in, and they are coming to repossess him. Andrew's jaw tightened. His sightless eyes stared blindly at the kitchen wall. Repossess? He's a living creature, Elena. Not a stolen Jeep. They don't care, Andrew. To them, he's stolen. Classified government property that poses a massive civilian threat. They're sending a specialized military working dog retrieval unit. If you fight them, they will arrest you. Please, Andrew, put him in the truck. Hide. I don't run, Elena, Andrew said, his voice dropping to that dangerous, gravelly register. And I don't abandon my squad. Let them come. He hung up the phone. Andrew walked slowly back to the living room. He knelt on the hardwood floor, reaching out until his hands found the thick, coarse fur of Titan's neck. The dog immediately sat up, sensing the shift in his handler's biochemistry. The relaxed morning atmosphere was gone, replaced by the sharp, metallic tension of impending conflict. They want you back, soldier, Andrew whispered, running his thumbs over the heavy scar tissue on Titan's jaw. They think you're broken. They think you're just a killer. Titan let out a low, questioning whine, licking the back of Andrew's hand. We stand our ground, Andrew commanded softly. No matter what happens today, you do not engage unless I give the word. Understood? Titan huffed, a sharp exhalation of breath, and pressed his forehead against Andrew's chest. The blood oath had been tested by thieves in the night. Now, it was about to be tested by the very machine that had forged them both. Snow began to fall heavily by mid-afternoon, blanketing the scarred earth of the driveway. Inside the cabin, Andrew sat in complete darkness, having turned off the breaker to the house. If the military wanted to breach his perimeter, they would have to do it on his terms in the pitch black. At 1,500 hours, Andrew's heightened hearing picked up the distinct, heavy crunch of specialized all-terrain tires chewing through the frozen gravel. 2 vehicles, heavy chassis, probably armored Suburbans. They rolled to a stop precisely where the thieves' truck had parked the night before. Doors opened and closed with heavy, solid thuds. Footsteps tactical, synchronized, and heavy with gear approached the porch. Andrew tracked their movements effortlessly. 4 men. 2 took up flanking positions near the windows. 2 approached the front door. Andrew recognized the faint, metallic clatter of M4 carbines bumping against tactical vests. He smelled the unmistakable cocktail of military-grade CLP gun oil, fresh Kevlar, and cold determination. Andrew Pendleton. A voice boomed from the porch, amplified slightly by a megaphone. It was Colonel Sterling, who had flown in personally to oversee the retrieval. This is Colonel Harrison Sterling, United States Navy. We are here under the authority of the Department of Defense to retrieve stolen government property. Open the door and secure the animal. Andrew stood up. He wasn't holding his M1911. He wore a heavy wool sweater and his combat boots. He walked to the door, Titan practically glued to his left knee. Andrew unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy oak door open. The freezing wind whipped into the cabin. Sterling stood at the bottom of the porch stairs, flanked by two heavily armed military police officers. Beside Sterling stood a master handler, Chief Petty Officer Reynolds, holding a heavy catchpole with a steel cable loop at the end. "You're trespassing, Colonel," Andrew stated, his voice easily carrying over the howling wind. "You have no jurisdiction here." "I have a federal warrant for the seizure of Asset 77 Bravo," Sterling snapped, pulling a folded document from his parka. "The dog is a highly classified, lethal liability. You are harboring a weapon of war, Mr. Pendleton. Step aside. He's not a weapon," Andrew replied, standing squarely in the doorway. "He's a retired veteran of foreign wars, same as me, and you abandoned him to die because you didn't have the patience to heal the wounds you inflicted on him." Reynolds, the handler, stepped forward, his eyes locked on Titan. He knew the dog's reputation. Every handler in the Navy knew about the beast in Kennel 4. "Pendleton, listen to me. That animal is unpredictable. He killed a man in Central America, and he put 2 men in the hospital last night. He is going to turn on you. It is just a matter of time. He protected my home," Andrew countered smoothly. "And he exercised extreme prejudice and restraint. He disarmed an intruder with a shotgun and didn't inflict a single lethal wound. Your training held up, Chief. You should be proud." "Enough," Sterling interrupted, his patience evaporating. "Chief Reynolds, secure the asset. MPs, if the dog shows aggression, you are cleared to tranquilize. If it charges, you are authorized to use lethal force." The 2 MPs raised their rifles, clicking the safety selectors off. The metallic snick-snick echoed loudly in the crisp air. At the sound of the weapons being readied, Titan's instincts flared. A deep, seismic growl erupted from his chest. He stepped in front of Andrew, his massive frame blocking the doorway, the fur on his back bristling. He bared his teeth, staring down the barrels of the rifles with absolute, unblinking defiance. "Titan," Reynolds commanded sharply, using the authoritative tone drilled into all handlers. Titan didn't even acknowledge the man. His amber eyes were fixed on the MPs holding the rifles. Reynolds tried again, shifting to Pashto. Nothing. The dog was completely unresponsive to the military authority he had obeyed his entire life. He only recognized one commander now. "He's locked on," Reynolds warned Sterling, gripping the catchpole tighter. "If I move in with this loop, he's going to strike. Do it, Chief." "That's an order," Sterling demanded. Reynolds took a tentative step up the wooden stairs. Titan's growl elevated in pitch, a terrifying harbinger of violence. The MPs tightened their grips on their triggers. "Andrew, call him off," Reynolds yelled. "I don't want to shoot this dog." Andrew realized the precipice they were standing on. Sterling was cold enough to order the dog gunned down on the porch, and Titan was loyal enough to take the bullets. Andrew needed to prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Titan was no longer a mindless military asset, but a specialized service animal operating under civilian protection. Andrew took a deep breath and intentionally, dramatically, let his knees buckle. He collapsed backward onto the hardwood floor of the entryway, hitting the ground with a loud, heavy thud. He let out a sharp cry of distress, mimicking the exact onset of a severe panic attack, his hands flying up to cover his face, his breathing turning rapid and shallow. The military men froze, confused by the sudden collapse of the stoic veteran. "What is he doing?" Sterling muttered, taking a step back. But Titan's reaction was instantaneous and entirely unexpected by the men holding the rifles. The dog didn't lunge at the perceived threat on the porch. He didn't attack Reynolds. The moment Andrew hit the floor, Titan's combat drive completely deactivated, overridden by a much deeper, newly forged instinct. Titan spun around, abandoning the door entirely. He rushed to Andrew's side, whining frantically. The massive, 90-pound killer shoved his blocky head under Andrew's hands, forcing them away from the veteran's face. When Andrew continued to hyperventilate, Titan executed the maneuver he had taught himself in the dark. He climbed fully onto Andrew's chest, laying his heavy body lengthwise across the man's torso. Titan pressed his heart against Andrew's heart, applying perfect, textbook deep pressure therapy. The dog buried his nose into Andrew's neck, completely ignoring the armed men standing just 10 feet away, willfully turning his back on a loaded threat to prioritize the medical and emotional safety of his handler. Silence descended on the porch, broken only by the howling wind and the soft, comforting whines of the German shepherd. Chief Reynolds slowly lowered the catchpole. His mouth was slightly open in disbelief. He had trained hundreds of dogs. He knew exactly what he was looking at. "Colonel," Reynolds whispered, his voice trembling slightly with awe. "Look at him. I see him, Chief." "Secure him," Sterling demanded, though his voice lacked its previous ironclad certainty. "No, sir. You don't understand," Reynolds said, taking a step backward, away from the door. "Asset 7-7. Bravo is gone. That dog right there. He's not an attack dog anymore. He's executing a high-level psychiatric medical alert and response." Sterling scowled. "He's faking it. The veteran is faking it. To keep the asset." "It doesn't matter if the veteran is faking it, Colonel." Reynolds shot back, pointing at the dog. "The dog doesn't know he's faking it." In the face of 3 armed combatants, that animal chose de-escalation and medical mitigation over aggression. You cannot seize him. By federal law, that dog is actively performing the duties of a vital service animal for a disabled veteran. If you pull him off that man right now, you aren't retrieving military property, you are stripping a blind man of his medical equipment. The optics of this will destroy your career. Sterling stared at the scene, the bureaucratic gears grinding to a halt in his mind. He looked at the heavy scars on Titan's flank, and then at the sightless man clutching the dog like a lifeline. The law was suddenly very murky, and the undeniable truth was playing out right before his eyes. Andrew slowly opened his sightless eyes, his hands buried deep in Titan's fur. The immediate threat of violence had been neutralized not by teeth, but by an undeniable display of empathy. But Andrew knew the military machine didn't just walk away easily. The battle was won, but the war for Titan's freedom was just beginning. Snowfall continued to blanket the Pacific Northwest, but the coldest front wasn't the weather, it was the chilling reality of federal litigation. Colonel Harrison Sterling did not back down after the standoff on the porch. He retreated, but only to regroup and weaponize the immense legal machinery of the Department of Defense. Within 48 hours, Andrew Pendleton was served with a federal injunction. The military was demanding a closed-door, expedited administrative hearing in Portland to legally sever Titan from Andrew's custody and compel the dog's immediate destruction as a hazardous biological asset. Andrew didn't panic. Panic was for men who had something to lose that they hadn't already surrendered. Instead, he made a single phone call to Elena Higgins. Elena, running on pure adrenaline and righteous indignation, bypassed the standard VA legal channels and secured the pro bono services of Margaret Covington. Margaret was a notoriously ruthless civil rights attorney who specialized in veterans affairs, known in the courtroom as a woman who chewed up federal bureaucrats and spat them out before morning coffee. 2 weeks later, Andrew walked into the federal courthouse in downtown Portland. He hated the city. To a blind man, a city is an overwhelming assault of chaotic audio data sirens, screaming off glass skyscrapers, the erratic hum of hybrid engines, the frantic, overlapping chatter of thousands of anxious people. But Andrew walked with a steady, unyielding stride, his left hand gripping the heavy leather harness strapped to Titan. Titan was magnificent. Margaret had insisted they outfit him in official service animal gear to establish immediate visual optics. He wore a deep burgundy vest with a bold service dog, "Do Not Disturb" patch. The dog navigated the crowded courthouse corridors with absolute, clinical precision. He didn't flinch at the slam of heavy mahogany doors. He didn't growl at the security guards. He simply pressed his sturdy shoulder against Andrew's knee, steering the blind veteran flawlessly around every obstacle. They entered Chamber 4B. The room smelled of lemon polish, old paper, and the distinct, sour odor of nervous perspiration. All rise for the Honorable Judge Thomas Barrett. Andrew stood perfectly still, listening to the rustle of fabric as the room settled. He could smell Colonel Sterling across the aisle, a crisp blend of military-issue starch and expensive aftershave. Let's dispense with the preamble. Counsel, Judge Barrett's voice boomed, gravelly and deeply resonant. Colonel Sterling, your brief claims this animal is a stolen, highly lethal weapon of war that poses an imminent threat to civilian life. Miss Covington, your brief claims the animal is a medically necessary psychiatric service dog. These are mutually exclusive definitions. Colonel, you have the floor. Sterling stood. Your Honor, Asset 77. Bravo is not a pet. He is a tier, one naval special warfare operative who suffered a catastrophic psychological break. He mauled a friendly medic in a combat zone. Just 3 weeks ago, he inflicted life-altering injuries on a civilian in Mr. Pendleton's home, shattering a man's arm. He is a loaded gun with a defective safety. Allowing him to remain in the civilian sector is an extreme liability to the public. He defended a disabled man's home against 3 armed, methamphetamine-addicted intruders. Colonel Margaret Covington shot back without standing. That is not a liability. That is a highly restrained, appropriate deployment of force. And he only did so on Mr. Pendleton's command. A command he will eventually ignore when his combat trauma is triggered, Sterling retorted. He is irredeemable. Is he? Margaret stood up, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Your Honor, I call Chief Petty Officer Reynolds to the stand. A heavy silence fell over the room. Andrew heard Sterling sharply inhale. Reynolds, the military's own master handler, had been subpoenaed by the defense. Reynolds took the stand, his boots heavy on the wooden steps. He swore the oath, his voice steady. Chief Reynolds, Margaret began, pacing slowly. You were present at Mr. Pendleton's cabin during the attempted retrieval of the dog. You are a master handler with 20 years of experience. Did you witness an aggressive, uncontrollable killer that day? Reynolds cleared his throat. He looked at Titan, who was lying quietly at Andrew's feet, his chin resting on his paws, amber eyes calmly watching the room. No, ma'am, Reynolds said firmly. I witnessed a textbook psychiatric de-escalation. Can you elaborate for the court? When Mr. Pendleton initiated a panic response, Reynolds explained, his voice echoing in the quiet chamber. The dog had 3 armed targets in front of him. Weapons were hot. The dog was exhibiting high-level threat displays. By all military metrics, Asset 77, Bravo should have engaged the threat to protect his handler. Instead, he broke visual contact with the armed men, turned his back on the rifles, and performed deep pressure therapy on Mr. Pendleton to regulate his heart rate. Reynolds paused, looking directly at Judge Barrett. Your Honor, I have trained dogs to kill, and I have trained dogs to heal. I have never, in my entire career, seen a combat dog actively choose to heal while under the direct threat of enemy fire. That dog is not irredeemable. He is fully rehabilitated, and he rehabilitated himself by finding a handler he respects. Margaret Covington smiled thinly. Thank you, Chief. But, Your Honor, I have one more piece of evidence, a twist, if you will. Regarding the night of the break-in, Margaret walked to the clerk's desk and handed over a flash drive. This is the raw, unedited body cam footage from Deputy Carlson, the second officer to enter Mr. Pendleton's cabin after the intruders were subdued. I asked the court to listen to the audio. Judge Barrett nodded. The audio crackled to life through the courtroom speakers. Sound of heavy breathing, the squeal of a door opening, Deputy Carlson's voice. Sheriff, Watch the corner. The little one is moving. Sound of a scuffle. A sharp, panicked yell from the intruder. Briggs! Carlson. He's got a knife. Margaret paused the audio. Your Honor, the police report filed by the Deschutes County Sheriff's Office states that, upon arrival, the intruder, known as Briggs, had managed to draw a concealed tactical blade while the deputies were focused on the man with the shattered arm. What happened next was not an attack by a vicious dog, but a surgical intervention. She hit play. A heavy, concussive bark. The sound of 90 pounds of dog hitting a human body. A clatter of metal on wood. Silence. Sheriff Davies's voice, breathless. Good boy. Jesus, good boy. Stand down. A low whine from the dog. Margaret shut off the recording. The body cam footage confirms the dog pinned Briggs's wrist to the floor with his paws, completely disarming him without breaking the skin, effectively saving Deputy Carlson from a lethal stabbing. He did not execute a kill command. He executed a civilian law enforcement hold. He is protecting his handler, and he is protecting our officers. Judge Barrett sat back in his heavy leather chair, steepling his fingers. He looked at Colonel Sterling, who was staring rigidly straight ahead, knowing the battle was entirely lost. Then, the judge looked at Andrew Pendleton, a man who had given his sight for his country, sitting with the quiet dignity of a soldier who had finally come home. The Department of Defense has a duty to manage its assets. Colonel Sterling, Judge Barrett spoke softly, but his voice carried the absolute weight of the law. But the United States government also has a sacred, unyielding duty to the men and women who bleed for this country. Mr. Pendleton gave his eyes to the desert. The least we can do is let him keep the ones he found in the dark. The judge picked up his gavel. I am officially stripping the hazardous biological asset designation from Asset 77. Bravo. The destruction order is permanently voided. Furthermore, I am signing a federal mandate transferring ownership of this animal to Mr. Andrew Pendleton, reclassifying the dog as a Tier 1 psychiatric and mobility service animal, fully protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The sharp crack of the gavel hitting the sounding block echoed like a gunshot. But this time, it didn't trigger a flashback for Andrew. It triggered freedom. Court is adjourned. The tension in the room shattered. Elena Higgins burst into tears, covering her face with her hands. Margaret Covington simply packed her briefcase with a satisfied, predatory smirk. Andrew didn't celebrate. He reached down, unclipped the heavy leather leash from Titan's harness, and let it fall to the floor. Free command, Andrew whispered. Titan stood up, shook his massive coat, and gently pressed his wet nose against Andrew's cheek. The blood oath had been officially recognized by the laws of men, but to the dog, nothing had changed. He had his commander, and his commander was safe. 6 months later, the oppressive Oregon winter gave way to a vibrant, fragrant spring. The cabin in the Deschutes National Forest was no longer a fortress of isolation. The heavy oak front door was propped open, letting in the smell of pine needles, damp earth, and blooming wildflowers. Andrew stood on the porch, not gripping a 1,911, but holding a mug of hot coffee. He couldn't see the brilliant green canopy of the trees, but he could feel the warmth of the sun on his scarred face, and for the first time in 7 years, he felt genuine peace. Titan lay on the top step, actively watching a pair of squirrels chase each other across the driveway. The aggressive, hyper-vigilant pacing was entirely gone. He was still a lethal protector, the scars on his face a testament to his past, but the frantic, broken energy had been replaced by a grounded, majestic calm. A silver sedan crunched up the gravel driveway. Andrew recognized the engine. It was Dr. Olivia Jenkins. "Morning, Andrew," Olivia called out, stepping out of the car. Titan trotted down the stairs to greet her, his tail giving a slow, rhythmic wag as he accepted a scratch behind his scarred ear. "Morning, Doc." Andrew smiled. You're early. Well, the new recruits don't wait. Olivia laughed, popping the trunk of her car. Andrew and Titan had found a new mission. Working in tandem with Olivia's veterinary clinic and the VA, Andrew had transformed his secluded property into a specialized rehabilitation sanctuary. They didn't work with normal dogs. They took in the unadoptable military and police K9s, the ones deemed too traumatized, too aggressive, or too broken for the civilian world. Andrew understood them perfectly. He knew that you couldn't train the war out of a soldier, but you could give that soldier a new war worth fighting. Olivia led a trembling, severely underweight Malinois out of her car. The dog had been retired from Border Patrol after an explosive breach had left it terrified of loud noises. It snapped defensively at the air, overwhelmed by the new environment. Andrew didn't approach. He stood on the porch and gave a soft, clicking sound with his tongue. Titan instantly stepped away from Olivia. He approached the panicked Malinois not with dominance, but with a calm, assertive alpha energy. Titan didn't bark. He simply stood beside the shaking dog, radiating an immovable, stoic presence. Slowly, the Malinois stopped thrashing. It looked at the massive, scarred German shepherd, sensing the unspoken authority and the profound safety that Titan represented. The smaller dog lowered its head and leaned against Titan's flank. Andrew walked down the stairs, guided flawlessly by the sound of the dog's breathing. He knelt in the gravel, reaching out his hand to let the new arrival take his scent. "Welcome home, soldier," Andrew whispered, stroking the Malinois' trembling head. "We've got a lot of work to do." Titan sat beside Andrew, his amber eyes scanning the tree line, not looking for threats, but simply watching over his pack. They were two broken weapons, forged in the fires of foreign wars, discarded by the very system they protected. But in the permanent midnight of Andrew's world, they had found the light in each other. They had survived the worst of humanity, only to prove that true loyalty doesn't require sight. It only requires a heart brave enough to step into the dark. The story of Andrew and Titan is a powerful testament to the resilience of the veteran spirit, both human and canine. Discarded by a system that viewed them as broken machinery, they proved that trauma does not equal obsolescence. Their journey highlights a profound reality. Sometimes, the most dangerous entities are simply those carrying the deepest, unaddressed pain. By refusing to let fear dictate their bond, Andrew and Titan transformed a potentially lethal collision into a beautiful, life-saving partnership. Their standoff against both criminals and bureaucratic machines serves as a raw reminder that loyalty, forged in the darkest of trenches, cannot be legislated away. Today, their continued mission to rehabilitate other fractured working dogs stands as a beacon of hope, proving that there is life, purpose, and profound healing to be found after the war is over.